In section 5.2, we will talk about basic factoring, where the leading coefficient, which is the a value, is equal to 1. So first, let's think about how are trinomials formed, and we're gonna specifically talk about quadratic expressions. So how's a quadratic expression formed? Let's take x minus 6 times x minus 7 and multiply that out. So let's take x minus 6 times x minus 7. If I distribute this, I get x times x, which is x squared. And then I get x times negative 7, which is a negative 7x. I have negative 6 times x, which is a negative 6x. And then I have negative 6 times negative 7, which is a positive 42. So then we have the x squared. Now let's think about how is a middle term formed. Well, the middle term is formed when I add the negative 7 and negative 6x. So in other words, when I add the negative 6 and negative 7, that's how the middle term is formed when I get it, because I get a negative 13x. Now, how is a lost term formed? I multiplied negative 6 times negative 7 to get a 42. So the lost term is formed when I multiply negative 6 and negative 7. So the middle term is formed when I add a negative 6 and negative 7, that's a negative 13. And the lost term is formed when I multiply the negative 6 and negative 7, which is a positive 42. So when we factor, this is essentially what we're doing. We're looking for two numbers which add up to be the middle term and which multiply to be the last term. So in other words, if I were to factor this, let's say I didn't know that this existed, I want to think about which two numbers, so the x squared is going to be x times x, which two numbers multiply to 42 and add up to be 13. Those are going to be 6 and 7. But because it's a negative 13, we have to have a negative 6 and negative 7. There are three different cases where the middle term and the last term are both positive. That's an easy case because we get two positives. What if the middle term is positive, but the last term is positive, but the middle term is negative? So in that case, it's kind of like what we had here. If two numbers multiply to positive but add up to be a negative, they both have to be negatives. And then the last term is when the last term is negative. And the only way to get two terms to multiply to be a negative is to have one positive and one negative. We'll talk about that later. Don't worry about that too much for now. And then always factor out the GCF first. With any kind of factoring, that is always your first step. So let's take x squared plus 8x plus 15. And we want to factor this out. So we want to have two terms which multiply to x squared plus 8x plus 15. And here's what we know. We know that whatever these two terms are, they have to multiply to be the last term. So they have to multiply to be 15. So we're going to use something called the x factor. And the way we're going to use it is we take the first term and the last term, the 1 and 15, and we're going to put those on top. We're going to multiply those. So 1 times 15 is 15. Those go on top. The middle term, which is the 8, that's going to go on the bottom. Now we got to think about which numbers multiply to 15 and add up to be 8. So the easiest way to do this is to list out all the factors of 15. So there's 1 and 15. 2 doesn't go into it. There's 3 and 5. And that's it. And always go in order. So go 1, 2, 3. Otherwise you forget factors or you miss factors. Now out of these, which ones add up to be 8? Those are going to be 3 and 5. Then the way I teach it is a little bit different, and right now it's not going to make a difference, but when we do more complicated factoring, this will make a difference. So the x squared, ignore the square and then just put the x on top of each. So we have x over 3, x over 5, and then that x falls over, so it's going to be x plus 3 times x plus 5. Like I said, right now this is not that important because we have the easy case, but I'm going to show you guys this methodology because when we do the harder case, we're going to use the exact same thing. So this is our factored form. What I recommend is you always check by foiling it. So x times x is x squared, x times 5 is 5x, 3 times x is 3x, and 3 times 5 is 15. If you add our like terms, we get x squared plus 8x plus 15. As long as you get this, the quadratic we started off with, this is correct. Let's take a look at the next one. we have x squared minus 18x plus 72. So we make our x factor, and we're going to put the 1 times 72. So you always multiply the first and last terms. That's going to go on top. The middle term, the negative 18, that's going to go on the bottom. Now with a 72, that's a little bit harder to do. But as long as you start with 1 and work your way down without forgetting any factors, this can work out. So we have 1 times 72. But notice that they both have to add up to be a negative. So we're going to make them a negative and a negative, because they have to multiply to be a positive, but they have to add up to be a negative. That's going to be case number 2. When two terms multiply to be a positive and add up to be a negative, they're both going to be negatives. So we have negative 1 and negative 72. We got negative 2 and negative 36. We have negative 3 and negative 24. We have negative 4 and negative 18. 5 doesn't go into it. We have negative 6 and negative 12. Then we have negative 8 and negative 9. And feel free to use a calculator. So if you don't know, does 2 go into 72? Just use a calculator. If you don't know if 3 goes into 72, use a calculator. But the main thing here is that they have to both be negatives, because they multiply to be a positive, but they add up to be a negative. Now of those, we want to see which of those add up to be a negative 18, and that's going to be negative 6 and negative 12. Now ignore the square and just put the x on top of each, so we get x over negative 6, x over negative 12, and then they fall over. So this is going to be x minus 6 times x minus 12, and that's your factored form. You can check it. X times x is x squared. X times negative 12 is negative 12x. Negative 6 times x is negative 6x. And negative 6 times negative 12 is 72. If you add your like terms, this gives you x squared minus 18x plus 72, which is going to be correct. All right, let's take a look at the next one. We have x squared plus 3x minus 40. So I take the first term times last term. So if I take 1 times negative 40, that's negative 40, goes on top. The middle term, 3, goes on the bottom. Now let's list all the factors of negative 40. If two terms multiply to be a negative, then you have to have one positive and one negative. So we got 1 and negative 40. We have 2 and negative 20. 3 doesn't go into it. We got 4 and negative 10. And we have 5 and negative 8. Now of those, which of them are going to add up to 3? So the only ones that add up to be something close to a 3 is 5 and negative 8. Because if you add 5 and negative 8, this gives you a negative 3. However, we want a positive 3. So instead of saying 5 times negative 8, we're going to switch that, because this adds up to a negative 3. We're going to switch it and make it into a positive 8 and a negative 5. Because that does add up to be a positive 3. So when you get the correct number but the wrong sign, just switch the sign. So it's going to be positive 8 and negative 5. 8 times negative 5 is negative 40. 8 minus 5 is 3. The reason we had one positive and one negative is because the only way for two numbers to multiply to be a negative 40 is if you have one positive and one negative. So then ignore the square, put the x on top of each, and then this gives you x plus 8 times x minus 5. And you can check it yourself, which I won't do, but you feel free to check yourself. Next, we have to factor 4x squared minus 20x minus 56. So the first step is going to be to take out the GCF. That's always your first step. In the other examples, we didn't have a GCF. In this example, we do. So if you take out a greatest common factor, when you take out a greatest common factor, essentially all you're doing is you're dividing everything by 4. So 4 divided by 4 crosses out. We have x squared. Negative 20 divided by 4 is negative 5x. Negative 56 divided by 4 is negative 14. So we take out the GCF. Now we only focus on this trinomial. So I have 1 times negative 14 is negative 14, and the middle term is negative 5. We want to find two numbers which multiply to negative 14 and add up to be negative 5. Those are negative 7 and positive 2. Notice that we got one negative and one positive because they multiply to be a negative 14. Now, if you can't just think of that, that's okay. List out all the factors of negative 14. So there's like negative 1 and 14. There's negative 2 and 7. these add up to be a 5, but we have to switch them because this adds up to be a positive 5. So it has to be a negative 7 and a positive times a positive 2, so they can add up to be a negative 5. So those are your two factors, negative 7 and positive 2. Put an x on top of each, and then make it fall over. So this is going to be x minus 7 times x plus 2. Don't forget about the 4. Make sure you bring it down every single time. All right, next example, we have x squared plus 4x minus 60, but now we want to actually solve it too. You want to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to start with there's no GCF, so I'm going to start with the x factor. I'm going to put 1 times negative 60. That's negative 60, put that on top. The middle term is a positive 4. Now I want to list out all the factors of negative 60. And notice it's negative, so we have to have one positive and one negative. We got 1 in negative 60. We have 2 in negative 30. We got 3 in negative 20. We have 4 in negative 15. We have 5 in negative 12. We have 6 in negative 10. Okay, now which of these adds up to be a 4? This one does, 6 in negative 10. However, that adds up to be a negative 4, so we have to switch the sign to be a positive 10 and a negative 6. So now they multiply to be a negative 60, but they add up to be a positive 4. And then I put an x on top of each. So when it falls over, we get x plus 10 times x minus 6, and that's equal to 0. So let me run through that one more time. I multiplied 1 and negative 60 to get a negative 60. The middle term was a positive 4. I found two numbers that multiplied a negative 60, add up to be 4, that's 10 and negative 6. Put an x on top of each, and that's our factored form. The zero product property says if two terms multiply to 0, then either x plus 10 has to equal to 0 or x minus 6 has to equal to 0. If I subtract 10, I get x equal to negative 10, that's one answer. If I add 6, I get x equal to positive 6, that's another answer. So our two answers are going to be x equal to negative 10 or x equals to positive 6. Okay, last one. Remember that anytime you have a factoring problem, especially one that is an equation, you have to get all the terms on one side. Get all terms on one side. They can't be on different sides. So what I'm going to do is, and you always want to keep the x squared positive. So I'm going to add 19x, and I'm going to add 90, because the opposite of a negative 19 is a positive 19, and same thing over here. And whatever I do to one side, I got to do the same thing to the other side. So to the x squared, I'm going to be adding a 19x, and I'm going to be adding a 90. And then here, these cross out, so we're left with a 0. So step 1, move everything to one side, and move it to the side where the x squared is positive. Now, when I factor this, I make my x factor. So I'm going to say 1 times 90 is 90. I multiply the first term times last term. The middle term is 19. So which numbers multiply to be 90 and add up to be 19? That's going to be 10 and 9. And then I put an x on top of each. So this gives me x plus 10 times x plus 9 equals to 0, which hopefully makes sense. 10 times 9 is 90, 10 plus 9 is 19. But I'm not done yet because I want to solve the equation. So I have x plus 10 equal to 0 or x plus 9 equal to 0. If I solve this, I get x equal to negative 10 or x equal to negative 9. And this is those are my answers. Now, factoring is always complicated, so you might have questions on it, and that's okay. Just come to class with those questions, and I'll be happy to answer them for you.